So,
Yeah.
huh. So greetings to everybody here and a very happy new year and a very happy Republic Day on behalf of the undergrads. Today we would be discussing the right to protest, and joining us is Miheer Jain, my senior from college, currently in his third year at NMIMS School of Law, Mumbai. And we also have Akshat Bhatia, who is my friend from Bangalore, and he is currently pursuing his LL.B from the United Kingdom and is in his second year. So the right to protest is something I believe which has great impact and great impact in terms of what it does in a democracy today. And the very ideals that which modern society is based on today largely come from protests. Going back to the French Revolution, talking about the pre-independence movement, the independence movement itself, and also coming to more modern things such as the Lokpal protests done by Anna Hazare, the CA NRC protests, and also the recent farmers protests. However, protests today in terms of democracy have changed a lot in terms of meaning, especially in terms of scope, wherein I believe that social media and technology has played a huge role in ensuring that the impact of a protest reaches far and wide, as we have seen in recent times. Uh, However, this also comes with a caveat, that is the dangers of misinformation and the very value of protest, and that the significance of a protest and what the intention of a protest is also being questioned today, because protests today are so many and we don't know which protest actually protests for uh, say betterment of society, and it's just seen as a symbol of anti-establishment or a sign of being cool, some may say. So with that, it leaves me to question what stance does protest have in today's democracy, and what stance does protest uh, mean to us as students in the student community. Yash, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah. So I think that there are very few countries around the world that practices a vibrant democracy, and fortunately, India is one of them. Now we have an independent election commission, which is a constitutional authority, and conducts free and fair elections around the country. And rarely, I believe that there have been any disputes with respect to its credibility. Now, naturally, the winner of such elections forms the dispensation, and the loser forms the opposition. And but the idea of right to oppose is something which is not just limited to the idea of opposition in parliament, but it consists, as Kshitij also mentioned, various groups, student groups, unions, NGOs, parties, or public at large, I would say. Now, if we talk about protests have had a very long and interesting history on this land. So, if you talk about the pre-independence era, so I would say the first war of independence, that was in 1857, was the first sign of protest that we showed in the form of a revolt against our oppressors. Now, later, if you come to the entry of Mahatma Gandhi, so I believe the protests, the andolans that were done under his leadership were a great signs of pan-India protest that we did against our oppressors. Now, if we talk about post India, I believe we cannot leave the idea of emergency and the way pan India protests were done at that period of time. That marks the very idea of protest that was done against the government. And as Kshitij mentioned, recent the Lokpal protest. So Anna Hazare, even in my opinion, I believe that that was a very systematic and principled protest that I could have observed. But the point that I'm trying to bring over here is that protest is something which has always been the essence of our society, but there is a change that we have noticed in the present system of protest that has been going on. And I believe now the protests are more used as a platform to spread hate or propaganda. The reason I'm saying this is, for very example, if I may take. So recently we saw a JNU scholar saying that if you collect a certain number of people and if you block northeastern area, the chicken neck theory, then you can cut off Assam. And there are various examples from both sides speaking about such languages. And I think sadly the same mentality and modus operandi was accepted or acknowledged by Shaheen Bagh, or even the present farmers protest that is taking place. So the idea and the narration is very simple, that will block the national capital and will pressurize the legislature to withdraw the law. However, having said all of this, I believe this is what we believe as what is right to protest. And this brings me to our first question. So Miheer, the question goes to you. How do you define the idea of right to protest? Like, how do you define its scope, and how exactly is right to protest works according to you?
All right, all right. Thank you, Yash and Kshitij, for asking me to come here and join in as a participant. And I would like to definitely encourage you guys and support you in this great initiative during these difficult times. All of us are here at least debating and discussing and actually deliberating on something as important as right to protest. As we can see, there are great protests and huge protests going on all across the country in the bannership of the farmers' bills that we have seen. So, in my opinion, right to protest is basically a tool that enables us or the aggrieved and as well as the masses to come forward and project their anger through a united front, which can possibly pressurize the incumbent, the authorities, or the body basically which has the power to right a wrong or undo an action. Now, nevertheless, this particular spirit has taken different shapes, and the spirit in which these protests are done or carried out in the contemporary situation sometimes take away the entire essence of peaceful protest, or why actually we should have a protest in the first place. You know, to name a few protests and provide a historical background to these peaceful protests. If you remember the Chipko movement, the national struggle against the unlawful detentions or the emergency in the year 1975, let's say the farmers' protests in the current situation, these would, in my opinion, to a certain extent and to a greater extent, qualify as peaceful protest. However, if you try to remember the small heated movements against the CEA in the remote areas of this country, which turned into atrocities by police in the NCR, and not to mention the overstepping of boundaries and activism by some students and professors. This actually makes us want to question the entire spirit of such protest. The one more example in a very contemporary situation, if I could give you, would be of the 2020 Bangalore riots or the Hindu Muslim communal riots, which we see across the country happening every day, right? So these are the protests that we need to take into consideration while we are drafting a notion in the back of our head as to what is a protest or what is actually our right to protest. Yeah, that would be from my end. Thank you.
Right. So, as far as just to conclude what you said, so you're more with the idea of peaceful protest, and you also recognize that obviously sometimes it goes out of the hand and it gets violent, right? Akshat, like, what's your opinion on the same?
Yeah, so firstly, as a fundamental concept, I think a protest is a last resort dissent to some injustice that is happening. I think a rational protest usually would be preceded by a legitimate political or legal avenue that is pursued. So I think at any point of time, if an injustice is done in the country, the first option to the citizens of the country is to pursue a political avenue, which is of course the devolution of powers to local legislature. You can talk to your local minister of parliament, you can talk to your local representatives, and they're supposed to represent you in government. That's the political avenue, following which comes the legal avenue, where you can apply for relief in court if certain discriminatory practices have happened within your community. And then the third and last resort, if both of these avenues are extremely corrupt, is protest. So I think fundamentally protests were designed to be followed by these two avenues, and that's what hasn't been followed so far. Like we see in the CA protest that there's no political or legal avenue before. I think if we want to systemically reduce the number of protests happening in our country, the best way to move forward would be to refine the political and legal avenues that are presented to its citizens, to the extent that we have systems in other countries. We have a system here where there's an online website for petitions, and if any petition online gets 100,000. I used this avenue recently, so I can recall from personal experience where we're still in a national lockdown in England right here, and the gyms were being closed, and I wanted, of course, me and my friends equally, we were being heavily impacted by the decision of gyms being closed. So we started an online petition, got it to 100,000 signatures, which requires Parliament to discuss it. And then we started emailing our local ministers of Parliament from here down south, as well as from up north. And we were like, okay, guys, just sort of pester your local representative to vote in your favor when the debate happens in a month or two. And then that's the political avenue. That's our first response to any injustice happening. If that does not happen, then there's the legal avenue. I think the most famous example of a protest being supplemented by a legal avenue is the Civil Rights Act in America, where the NAACP started suing for relief in the 1945. They had no reason to sue. They already they'd been locked out of the justice system for 70 years, but they still kept knocking on the door of the courts. They kept knocking, and they kept knocking for 20 years, and that was complemented by protests, and those two together got the black man the civil rights. So I think fundamentally a protest is supposed to be a last resort and not a first resort. And usually when I see people's immediate reaction to a protest, to an injustice happening, is start protesting. That's when I think that protest is either politically motivated or ill, or from, it's just not rational enough. As to the legal right of right to protest, I think India lies perfectly between the continuum of too permissive or too oppressive, and I use the word oppressive with caution because of how cool it's become now. I think if I were to lay a multi-jurisdictional analysis of the right to protest in countries, I'd say the US is to the right where it's too permissive, and China is to the left where it's too oppressive. Because of course we've seen the recent problems in the US where the fabric of their union has been tainted because of the number of protests allowed. So I think India has the a very nice balance between oppressive and permissive in terms of course, sedition laws. I think there's a lot of Instagram stories going around in the past month about how sedition is a colonial concept, and it was used by our colonizers to suppress us, and it's not a democratic concept. That's not true. In fact, the colonizers themselves use sedition law. The sedition law here, the sedition law in Canada, the sedition law in the United States of America. In fact, it's more oppressive here than in India, to the extent where anything said against the crown could be considered sedition. The case in hand being ex parte Chaudhry. In Canada, there's a case as recent as 1970. It's called the Amy Boucher case, where they have sedition laws over there. So I think India is perfectly right in between the continuum of the United States, which is too permissive in their laws that help them taint the fabric of the union. Because the fabric of the union is important. India is a very tight-knit union. And we're seeing, of course, in the States, they're suffering with the secession of Texas. They're continuously trying to leave the union, predominantly by virtue of the fact that such protests have been allowed that are fundamentally tainting the fabric of the union.
Right. So as far as I could cover, I really like the idea that there should be a system before you go to the protest. So protests are something which is the last resort. And this brings me, to be honest, to the second question. So in India now, we have observed a new normal where at the drop of a hat, the national capital is blocked in the name of peaceful protest. And there is an inability from the government side to address such protests. The reason why I'm saying this is because recently in the Shaheen Bagh judgment, the Supreme Court slammed the authorities for not clearing the public places which were blocked by people. They were waiting for the Supreme Court's intervention. If we talk about the present farmers' protest, the same is happening over here as well. They have been to the Supreme Court, but they're not taking actions which are under their powers. So it's a twofold question. One being, how do you see that protests have evolved throughout these years? Like, how do you see the tactics have changed, or how NGOs have played a role? Anything. How do you see it has evolved? And second being, is there an inability from the government side in India? And if yes, what's the way forward?
And is that to me, or
Yeah,
is that
that's to you, Akshat. That's to you.
Oh, is that to me? Okay, great. So I think I really like the fact that you used the Shaheen Bagh example. I believe you're talking about the Amit Sahani case, where they said that the blocking of a public case requires intervention from authorities. I think it's important for a country to draw the line between protest and vandalism, or a protest and a riot, very clearly. I think the line is judicially unclear in India, to the extent where the requirements of a riot in some cases have been force and collective object. But I think the one element of a riot that the country needs to determine, and that I've seen all over the place, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not a scholar of Indian law, that I've seen all over the place in Indian law, is whether or not vandalism by an individual in a protest would then shift the responsibility to the collective assembly as an unlawful assembly, by which I mean, of course, if one person in the protest is committing an act of violence or vandalism, does that collectively mean that the unlawful, the assembly is unlawful. And in some countries, the rule is that yes, it does mean that if one person commits violence, and the entire assembly is considered unlawful. In some countries, the standard is higher, which is that the assembly should actively encourage the individual's vandalism in order to be considered an unlawful assembly. So I think that's one line that the government needs to draw more clearly. And that's something I haven't seen addressed in as much of the penal code as I've read. And so I think that's one way forward, right? That's to determine whether or not, if a single person, because that's how usually these protests go wrong, right? One single person commits an act of violence and then the police respond and so on and so forth. So what is our law? Is it that one person committing violence would then shift the responsibility to the collective group? Or is it that the collective group must actively encourage violence in order to be considered unlawful? So I think that's one way, and certainly I believe that there's a thin line between and public places. I think the rule is clear in public places, but with Amit Sahni and with the Mazdoor Kisan case, I think it was in 2018, where there was a Supreme Court had a similar judgment as to the blocking of public places. It was Jantar Mantar, I believe. I think the rule with regard to occupation of public places has been made clear legally, and it's only up to the authorities to implement those. But the rule with regard to whether or not a group claims collective responsibility of an act of vandalism is unclear to me. Perhaps it is clearer to you, and you can educate me on that. But as far as I've read, it's unclear to me.
Right. So you believe there should be more clarity in the idea where your right to protest ends and where you exactly start infringing the rights of other people in the form of vandalism or violence. I get the point. Yes, Miheer, what's your opinion on this question?
All right, thank you, Yash. So, well, to first respond to one of the queries which was put across by Akshat, that if any person is basically infringing upon your right to peacefully protest for a particular cause, if you are protesting peacefully, and if the other person is basically infringing upon it by using the violence means, then will you be held responsible for that particular action or not? So in India, the diaphragm in the legal perspective, what we hold is most of the time is determined both by the physical action and the intent that you have. But multiple times the Supreme Court or the judiciary has held out that in the garb of for the police authorities or the state government or the other authorities, let's say, in the garb of holding these protests to be peaceful, you cannot ultimately cut down on those protesters who are peacefully protesting. You cannot, in the garb of eliminating those elements of the society who are not protesting peacefully, you cannot eliminate these people who are actually protesting peacefully. So ultimately the stand that we have in the current society is that if you want to join a particular protest that is going on peacefully, and if you yourself want to protest peacefully, well, go ahead, fair enough, you are definitely invited to do that. However, if you eventually yourself end up participating in a violent action, then you are going to be held liable for that. If someone else is doing that, then definitely the liability is not going to be shifted on you. Now, I also want to engage with one of the perspective that was shared by Akshat, that we have two redressal mechanisms. One is the legal avenue and the other one is the political avenue. Now, with regards to the legal avenue, at least talking about the Indian like our particular state, what happens in our particular country is that if a state body or any authority is infringing your fundamental right or is violating your legal right, then you already have multiple legal venues to approach the state or to approach your representatives. However, the problem with this is the amount of time that it actually takes in our society to get your fundamental right, or the right that particular right that is getting violated, to get it addressed by the state or let's say by the judiciary. The amount of time it is going to take, it is going to be a completely futile effort from your end, and that is why you end up actually resorting to something like right to protest. Now, talking about the other avenue that you were talking about, that is the political one. Now, what I think and understand in the contemporary situation is that when most of the times right to protest or basically protest across the countries or in the remote areas happens, they do not happen because you or me, basically you and I want to protest. It happens primarily because someone sitting at the top of a particular organization, or let's say someone sitting at the top of a particular political ideology or party, let's say, they want to initiate these particular protests. So these protests are not motivated by a single cause, uh, held by you or me, these particular protests are highly motivated, and not only motivated but actually by funded by these particular political parties and people sitting at the top of different particular organizations. Now, to answer the original question that Yash asked, now with protests significantly increasing every day, the trend is definitely voicing of opinion in a violent way. Authorities trying to suppress the voices of the protesters by invoking Section 144, and on the other hand, protesters, turning into a mob and breaking the police barricades and whatnot. So all I have to say is that in this particular situation, both the authorities, the incumbent, and the people raising their voice, both need to be a little more sincere and responsible in their approach. Governments and incumbents or the authorities need to allow a little free more space and dialogue, and the protesters, on the other hand, to not take this free space or this dialogue building approach as more and more leverage to negotiate. So this is what I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Miheer. That was actually very insightful. And we get it that there should be sincerity in the working of the governments or and among the people, and there should be certain cohesion between the two and how they go about the entire thing. So with that, my next question is also to you. So we see that we now live in an era of social media, wherein we are all flooded with information every day. So much information that sometimes we are guised by misinformation. And when we are guised by misinformation, we're often misguided and we end up doing the wrong thing because we had the wrong information. So this was seen in the case of the CA NRC protests, which eventually became the Shaheen Bagh protests, and then it eventually became the North Delhi riots. Likewise, in Bangalore, just because one person from a particular community posted against the other, it became a Hindu-Muslim communal riot, which almost led to 144 being imposed on the entire city of Bangalore. So with that, do you think we are moving from a more from uh, constructive and progressive protests to more regressive, destructive protests? If yes, what is the way forward?
Thank you so much, Sudesh, for this particular question. Now, I'll start answering this particular query by saying, tell me about it. I live in a family where the source of information is considered to be WhatsApp or YouTube every time when I am at my place with my family members. The news, our debate of 9. Right after that, we actually start our debates on different political ideologies with the information that my father or that my mother has gathered through WhatsApp or YouTube. So definitely this is a major problem in our society. And I think the first thing that we need to do is stop paying attention to everything that we receive and see either through WhatsApp, let's say Instagram, YouTube, or any other information broadcasting agencies, as most of the times, at least through what I can recall through my personal experience, is the kind of information that is circulated on these particular platform, they're not backed up with facts. And the sole intention behind the circulation of these information is promotion of destructive protest. And you may reach out to this conclusion by actually taking into considerations the kind of post that came up right after the Tablighi Jamaat incident. Now, I would definitely not want to say this because I do not hold that opinion. But when you talk about something like Islamophobia, or let's say the feeling of apprehension, fear, or hatred against a particular community, that is very concrete and profound in our society. And the reason behind it is very simple, that people are propagating these ideologies through these particular platforms and belonging to society or a country where the mass populace or the state actually holds a significant population of one particular community. What we need to understand and not only take into consideration but internalize in every fiber of our being is that we should stop paying attention to this particular information or these particular sources of information. And the best way to go about it is, Kshitij, you should start with your own family. Akshat, you should start with your own family. Yash, and you and I should start with our own families, because you and I are definitely educated and are advanced enough to understand, okay, the information that is broadcasted by these agencies, they definitely lead up or eventually lead to destructive protest. However, the generation to which our parents belong to, or most of the people of the society belong to, they are not going to understand that yes, these particular information or these particular sources of information are not credible enough. So all we need to do right now is start with our own family, start with the people that are surrounding us, start with the people that we know. And I think after a point we are going to be in a situation where slightly slowly we are going to completely eliminate this, this haphazard or this entire connotation of fake news that we have in our society. Yeah.
Thank you, Miheer. So I get your point that we all jump the bandwagon when we see something on WhatsApp without fact checking. And it comes down to us to actually verify the facts and look into what it is before we go into it. And also the fact that every news or every bit of information that comes on these sources like WhatsApp and YouTube have certain political agendas, and we have to review that before we go through it is actually a very valid point. So with that, I would like to move to Akshat. Akshat, what are your reflections on this particular topic?
Absolutely. So I think there's a total of 3 points that I have. The first one is an attitude problem among both our and in fact every generation, right? Because the attitude problem is they would rather speak and be misinformed than be silent, right? And that's a fundamental, simple. It's a psychological issue, right? Because again, in our previous question, I framed one of my points as a question to Mihir rather than information, because I would rather be silenced than be wrong, right? I don't want to spew misinformed information on a public platform like this. Therefore, if I am not a scholar of law in India, then I'm not going to talk about law in India. I'm going to talk as much as I'm sure of fundamentals of the Constitution. But if I want to talk more specifically about law that I have no idea about, I'm going to phrase that as a question and not as a point, because I'd rather be silent than be misinformed. I think that is an attitude that is not present in all throughout generations in our country. I was having a conversation yesterday with one of my colleagues here in the UK who reposted on Twitter or Instagram. It was just one of these posts about Bombay High Court ruling yesterday about sexual abuse and the POCSO Act, and it's going around Instagram, and the post suggests that the Bombay High Court ruled that an obvious act of sexual offence was not sexual offence, while I sort of tried to read a bit deeper into it, and I understood that it was a problem of interpretation between one act, the POCSO Act, and the IPC. And I replied to her story, and it was an Instagram story, I believe, and I replied saying, okay, here's the actual reality. It's sort of deeper than this. And she replied saying, I hate Indian media for doing this. And then the next story on her Instagram feed was another one of these Instagram posts, sort of activist Instagram posts. So I think there's an attitude problem that people don't understand that they'd rather be silent than misinformed. I think when the CAA NRC protests were going on, I was silent for a long period of time because I couldn't get my hands on legislation that I wanted to, on cases that I wanted to see that were pertinent to the Constitution of India and discriminatory practice therein. And I contacted one of my friends from Bangalore, a mutual friend of mine in Kshitij. His name is Sumuk. I contacted him and I said, hey, buddy, can you give me access to these cases? Because he's a law student in India, so of course he'd have access to those cases. And only when he sent me those cases, that's when I came out to public and I formed my opinion. So I think people are very comfortable with the possibility of being misinformed, which is a major problem. The second problem is, of course, the sources problem, right? Because of course, when I looked up, I remember doing this exercise where I looked up the CAA NRC protest on Google, and the first article, the first sentence, it's a TOI article. It suggests that the act was made specifically with the intention to discriminate against a certain religion. And while that may be a perspective that people hold, that is not the only explanation of the facts. And it is perfectly intelligent to hold an alternative perspective to that. So the first sentence of the first article of the CAA NRC Google search would tell you that the act was specifically founded with the intention to discriminate against a certain religion. Now, I Googled the farmers' protest, and this article was dated January, and it was by The Economist. And the first article on Google, the first Google search article, suggested that the government of India had made no attempt to negotiate with the farmers. Now, when the first two articles by major publications, by the way, present such strong opinions, and you cannot differentiate between an opinion column and an editorial column on a newspaper, then that's a problem, right? Because what's happening is they are ramming views down their throats, down your throats. And the job of the news fundamentally is not to give you information, but rather to give you opinions, which is just fundamentally wrong, right? And the way I like to do my research, and that's why I haven't been able to stay as active as I want in Indian politics, is because there's no websites for and there's no websites that I'm aware of, and please let me know if you're aware of, for only information and no opinions, right? Where I can completely filter out the opinions. In the US, there's a website called Tatum Report that does this. If I want to think about a corporate issue, then I can go on the website of the SEC and look at the public filings of every company. If there is a political issue, I either go on Tatum Report or so some other sort of government department, a State Department Defense website, and I look at facts independent of opinions, right? And that's a problem, where we don't have enough sources and enough websites that give you facts independent of opinions. And then the third thing, and this might be a long reach, is also a fundamentally cultural problem. Which is our schooling. From the very beginning of school, we've been taught to digest opinions and not formulate our own opinions, right? And I can't I can't count on my fingers the number of times I've been thrown out, looked down upon, or even suspended from school once for having a fundamentally different opinion from my professor or teacher. To the extent that we are not taught to, and this is specifically in history and economics, because these subjects are some, my school taught me a particularly Keynesian, the field of economics, while I believe in a different ideology. So when I fundamentally disagreed with the ideology, that I was looked down upon, and I was said, okay, listen, right, the book is telling you this opinion, and you have to take that opinion and count that as your own. So we are fundamentally programmed to take opinions and digest them, rather than if our education was such that they were throwing a set of facts at us and telling us to formulate our own opinions, and if that was encouraged, and I've done that on multiple occasions since moving into university, where I fundamentally disagreed with the professor's opinion, and he wrote back to me and he said, you know what, I'm writing a research paper on this. Why don't you meet with me for 30 minutes, have a cup of tea, and we'll discuss the fundamental disagreement. So when we're not taught to critique the things that are told to us, that results in people just sort of taking these opinions in without sort of bothering to look it up on Google, or do further research, or formulate your own opinions. So I think there's a deep cultural problem, to the extent that we're not trained and programmed to form our own opinions. Obviously, with the exception of law students, because we're sort of taught to critically think that way. And then there's a more concrete problem, which is the sources problem, and the idea that people are comfortable with being misinformed and spewing out misinformed information.
Thank you, Akshat. I believe that you've explained everything quite well when it comes to what problems we face when it comes to understanding, digesting information, and then processing it and using it in making our opinions, and also telling others and sharing our opinions with others. Which brings me to the next question, and it's to you, that we have seen a trend that has been set, also established in today's discussion, that, and when we go back to 2020, we see the North Delhi riots, then we move to the Black Lives Matter riots, and then we see numerous incidents in Sweden, Norway, France, Switzerland, with respect to violence and religion. And also, when we come to even more later events, we've seen the the CA NRC has been extended, and also we've seen the farmers' protest, which has turned violent today, and we saw the farmers entering into Delhi. So, do you think that violence is now being seen as the go-to solution, or are people just as frustrated with protesting with no base, or with no stronghold? Are they just protest? Are their protests going in vain? And is violence their only way to, in which they believe that their voice will be heard? If yes, is violence the new trend? Uh,
Sorry, I was muted. So I think that there's 3 points that I make in this regard. The first of which is that there's this common perception. Sorry, my iPod's not charging. There's this common perception that the more infuriated you are, the more justified your protests are, and that perception is constantly pushed by the media, where you see these Black Lives Matter protests happening, and they're like, look at these guys, they're so angry, and they're tired of the system, and they're tired, and they're angry, and the whole narrative is not about how legitimate their concerns are, but about how angry they are. So that creates a common perception among people that the more angry you are, the more legitimate your protest is, right? Which is just fundamentally untrue. So I think the reason that violence has been a common factor in protests is because there's been this common perception that the government will listen to you if you are angrier and if you're more infuriated. And it's happened across Europe. You see Poland, when they had their abortion law, and then they were protested in, and they caved, and they said, okay guys, you're angry, so we're not going to do this, right? And a lot of governments have caved in to violent protests, which makes people believe that, if we're angrier, the government is more likely to listen to us, which is just fundamentally untrue, and it's not supposed to happen that way. So I think that's the first of 3 points that I'd like to make. The second one of which is, I think there's a popular conservative voice by the name of Michael Knowles, who wrote an article about this, which is that these riots and protests in the past year and a half have been significantly impacted by lockdown, to the extent that people are angry because, it's a hard time. They've got nothing to do. They're locked in their houses, and most of their time is going towards, just taking in all this information about how corrupt our government is and how bad our government is, which is whatever that proposition is. And the reason that these protests have been particularly large during the pandemic is predominantly by virtue of the fact that people are in lockdown, or were in lockdown at that point of time. And here people are still in lockdown, and in America, of course, people are still in lockdown. And because they're in lockdown, they're out of jobs, and they're already pissed off, and this is sort of adding to that. So I think that's another perspective we can bring in, to the extent that this particular year has been hard for a lot of people, and they've got too much time on their hands, so to speak. And with the BLM and the capital rights, I think, again, there is a deeper cultural problem to this, which is that this particular, which is specific in this generation, which is that there's a cultural stigma to seeking victimhood, which is that, there's a social victimhood hierarchy. The more of a victim you are, the cooler you are on social media, and you say, oh, I went through this and I went through that, and everything you cannot achieve is a result of the system, right? If you're not making enough money, it's because of capitalism. If you're not doing this, it's because of sexism or racism. And I agree that these are real life problems, and there should be legitimate responses to it. But there is a social wave of seeking victimhood. And when people's mind is programmed that way, to seek victimhood in every activity that you pursue, rather than taking personal responsibility, that results in people being more infuriated and always blaming the system. Government bad, government corrupt, this guy's bad, that guy's bad, here's bad, rather than taking personal responsibility. So I think that cultural shift, where earlier the legitimate response to a problem you're facing personally was to take personal responsibility and make yourself better. But nowadays, the legitimate response to sort of any deprivation or any problem in your life is to blame the system and blame the government. I think that's obviously contributing to how violent these protests are. So I think those are the three factors to it.
Thank you so much, Akshat. I believe that you're trying to say that we shouldn't play a game of blame. Rather, we must take responsibility, collective responsibility, and go forward with whatever it is, and understand that we have one problem and we need one solution. So, with that, I'd like to give it to Miheer. Miheer, what are your thoughts and reflections on this particular question?
All right. Thank you, Shatuj. Now, yes, well, I definitely agree with all the reasons and the rationale that has been put across by Akshat as to why are people delving into such an attitude, or why are people definitely playing these blame games and not taking rather a collective responsibility, as Shatuj you pointed out. And I believe that yes, the trend is that of a violent one, and the reasons have definitely briefly explained by Akshat. But why people believe this particular notion that if you are violent, you can make the authority, or the incumbent on the receiving end, to listen, or you can create an environment which has such a high level of magnitude of fear that will eventually make the other side, or the government, surrender. So this particular connotation or notion is very profound and is as concrete as possible. At least in the Indian society, definitely it's very profound. And the one thing that I would like to say and conclude this would be a point that I've already said. I would like to reiterate that most of the time these protests are not managed by regional groups. Most of the times these particular protests that we see every day, as you were pointing out, that the farmers protest actually gained a violent momentum today. Now, what we need to understand and internalize is that it's not because of a particular issue that a farmer has, or the farmer is the victim in this particular situation, but it's about the fact that these particular regional groups or entities, they do not have good or bad cause. They are just highly motivated or slash funded by the leaders or different organizations which actually sit at the top of different political ideologies, and they just try to create as much as hate slash fear or opposition against the incumbent or the authorities. The day we start understanding and internalize in every fiber of our being that okay, we are not going to pay attention to these particular political ideologies, rather what we are going to do is we are going to stick with the side that is doing good. Let's say tomorrow if any particular government, or let's say if any particular political ideologies does good, we are going to support that. The very subsequent day, if that particular political ideologies or that particular government does bad, we are going to oppose that particular side. So to conclude this, we should stand with policies. We should not stand with a particular political ideology, or let's say with a particular authority, or let's say with a particular incumbent. The day we start internalizing that, yes, we stand with policies. If you are making good policies, I am supporting you. If you are not creating good policies, or if you're a bad legislator, then I am going to censure you. I am going to contempt you. I am going to criticize you. That day, I think step by step we are going to be able to achieve somewhat of what we are trying to do right here. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I have a little bit of a question with regard to one of the previous ones, and I'd appreciate an answer. Is that so? I understand and I agree absolutely with Miheer's point about these protests usually being organized by someone higher up rather than 2 people or 3 people facing problems, or the country as a whole facing problems. And so with the rise of access to internet in rural areas, what do you think about a potential petition mechanism? And I'll explain how the mechanism works over here, which is that you can literally hop onto the government website. There's a petition mechanism where you can sign so you can start a petition. And if that petition gets 100,000 signatures, or obviously in the case of India, there's a higher population, so of course like 200,000 or 500,000, 5 lakhs, 10 lakh signatures, then the government will discuss it in parliament in maybe 1 or 2 months course. And within that 1 or 2 months, you can compel people from all around the country, or persuade people from all around the country to talk to their local representatives. And that's how the devolved power works, right? So my local representative will possibly reply to me and say, okay, let me know what you want. And we can discuss with her, and perhaps she will best represent my interest in her vote in parliament, as well as everywhere across the country. And wouldn't that mean that all the legitimate protests, the legitimate concerns that citizens have that are not higher up in the political hierarchy, are actually addressed by parliamentary debate rather than having to resort to protest? I think that would filter out the legitimate concerns that people have as a parliamentary means, rather than rather than having to resort to protest. So just let me know what you think about that, and if that is a sort of suitable method in India.
Sure. Should I go ahead and respond to
Yeah,
that?
absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Shudaj. All right, Akshat, definitely that is a wonderful mechanism. And in fact, in India, I don't know if you know this or not, but recently the legislature actually dwelled into the matter of data protection, and the data protection bill came up, and it got revised, and then it eventually came up like the amended version in year 2019. Now, when we go into the historical background of this data protection law, how did it actually start? There were actually certain individuals interested in telecom regulations who basically started out a petition, and they themselves drafted a particular tentative petition which had all the details or all the regulations that this particular state or society needs to have on data protection. And that is how, if you look at the current draft, most of the provisions or most of uh, the instruments that are incorporated in that particular amended draft actually belong to what these people, these individuals, these NGOs started with. It actually belongs to that draft only. And it all started with a petition only. But the only problem with this redressal mechanism is that it's very urban. As you pointed out, we require something like access to internet. no matter what Modi says, no matter what people say, how urbanized we actually are or how modernized we actually are, access to internet is still a very significant and a profound problem in our country. And to understand, to address and acknowledge the local issues, the rural issues, I really don't think we are in a particular era where we can do this, because it's not very easy to first reach out to someone in a rural area because they do not have internet, or let's say a smartphone or any particular to go about it, right? So if you're talking about any particular problem to be acknowledged in an urban area, let's say in Mumbai or any other metropolis area, then definitely there's a wonderful mechanism and it is actually working. In Mumbai, if you see a pothole and or if you see a particular problem and you want the local municipal corporation of Mumbai to address it, you actually click a picture, there's a particular application of BMC, you point it out, and within few days that particular problem gets rectified, that particular problem is addressed. However, in rural areas it's not possible, but yes, with time I think this is going to be one of the most efficient ways, as we students also use this petition when it comes to addressing our problems in day-to-day college life. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I agree. And if the petition mechanism is linked to the government, that would be slightly better. But
Yeah.
I understand your argument that it's a rule of law problem as well, to the extent that if this goes on, if we have a petition mechanism, then the problems of urban areas in the legislative process will take precedence over the problems of rural areas, because they will not have as much of an option to voice their opinions in the population as the urban people will have. So I understand that it's a problem right now, but certainly an endeavor to look towards in the future.
Yeah, I think so. With that clarification, we come to the end of our video. I think there were some amazing points which were raised. So starting from the idea of how, so I believe even non-law students who are watching this video, they'll understand the idea of right to protest, the idea of reasonable restriction or peaceful protest. I really like certain points which were, so for example, breaking down the psychology problem that people have in terms of violent protest, or the attitude problem, or the system which was raised, or even Mir mentioned a very brilliant point that how the people whom we are seeing are not the actual protester. There's someone setting, there's an organization, or maybe so to say some intellectuals who are misleading people and causing them to get violent or something as such. Even the point that you mentioned regarding the petition, even just adding to what Mihi said, I believe even education plays an important role over here. Like for very example, if you take the legislation of CAA, you cannot expect an uneducated person or someone to go in a rural area and explain what is positive discrimination. How would you address that? And in India, we have mass numbers of people, so you can collect people, but it's the credibility again would be in question. The laws will be again in questions. So that is something which is a bit difficult, but again, there should be always discussion on the same. Again, thank you so much for joining us in this
All right. So, with taking from Yash, I believe that, and I would always iterate on this point that uh, protests, understanding what the right to protest is a very imperative thing, especially in the student community, as we are the torchbearers of future society, and we are the ones who are going to take place of the current generation in terms of governance. Going through today's debate, I believe wonderful points were made by both Akshat and Mihir, and we addressed and probably very comprehensively covered what protest means to us as students and even beyond by understanding the psychology, as Yash mentioned. Further, we also, I believe that we got a global perspective because yeah, Akshat gave us a very, very, very good insight into how protests work in the UK, and even before protests, the political method to address certain issues, how that works about in the UK was mentioned. And also it does exist in India, I believe. However, the urban rural social divide does come into that picture. Talking about the BBMP or the BMC, we see if a tweet is put out, our issues are solved almost instantaneously. But whereas in rural areas, the problems are much bigger, and it's not problems that can be tweeted or problems that can be solved through an app. So the worries and concerns of the people there traverse what the smaller issues are. But yet, the power of technology is something we must understand. It's both a boon and a bane, which we heard in today's debate as well, where misinformation exists on one side. On the other side, it helps in petitions through change.org or any other website of that nature. So, with that, I believe we got a comprehensive and a very holistic understanding of what the right to protest is. And I thank both of you, both Akshat and Miheer for coming and joining us today and giving your perspective on these videos. So with that, I would like to say goodbye and till next time. Bye-bye.
All right, Kshitish, thank you for